Hi, you're listening to the ASC podcast. The ASC Wellbeing Clinic is a private specialist psychotherapy service based in Southend. The Ask It podcast encourages talking about talking, facilitates your own inner wisdom, and rather than providing answers, considers good questions. Today's Ask It podcast explores shame with Leslie and Lucinda. They ask, how do we manage shame and how do we work with shame in the therapy room?
First of all, shame isn't what they call a first order emotion, i.e. it's not something you experience at birth. You kind of learn shame. The idea that shame is important for our survival in the sense of shame makes you act altruistically and think of being part of the community and what's acceptable and what's not. One thing that really emerged when I was thinking about shame versus guilt, so if guilt is about the thing I've done, the behaviour I've done or the transgression, shame is about me and feeling that I'm bad, I'm an alien, I'm some ugly plant thing, I'm unacceptable, not something I've done. And so shame is so inward focused, isn't it? Shame is all consuming, and the only way you're concerned about the other is their judgments of you.
Yes.
Whereas guilt really considers the other and the impact on the other and what you've done and how that might be awful and you don't want to do that again and that's not acceptable to society. I was looking at this study that interviewed people when they were young and then interviewed them again later, and they looked at whether people were guilt prone or shame prone, and those that were guilt prone were motivated to do things for their community, be a part of the world, had good self-esteem, wanted to go to college, whereas those that felt shame had less value of self, so were involved in more reckless behaviours, actually more likely to be involved with the justice system because they're not considering the impact on themselves really or other people.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting because the one thing that Kathy that we saw,
Kathy Steele,
she was saying about the importance of compassion and empathy with somebody that's experiencing shame.
Yeah.
But people that experience shame don't have a lot of empathy because they're not concerned so much with the other, or caring about the other beyond how they're judging me.
And I guess somewhere deep in them they will, but they're cut off, I imagine. Absolutely. It's so excruciatingly painful that the defences are so strong. Janine Fisher, her current thinking is she doesn't work empathically so much with shame. She works more with asking questions around how their behaviour supported them. So the intervention, if someone said, well, I just thought of myself as very ugly and this was ugly and that was ugly, and she would say, so how did that work out for you? She doesn't get into, what was that like for you? And she doesn't do the empathy. She works more with getting them into thinking about how that way of thinking was a survival strategy that may have supported them.
I think that's a really important point when you're looking at how to work with it, because we know, don't we, some people, unless you go there and enter their world and say, I can see that, and you do all the empathy bit, they're so resistant they won't move from that place. And if you try to move someone on too quickly from that place, you're just going to meet resistance. But then we know we've got other patients where you could sit for 10 centuries in that place with them and no change will happen.
Nothing will move. And I think what's often absent, really, if you do the empathy forever with some clients, is there's genuine skill sets missing within them because they haven't taken risks, because the shame is so crippling. Even if they've got a handle on the shame or they think they have and they want to move out into the world, because it's interesting that you said the guilt people move out into the world and the shame people, they do move out into the world, but they move out into the world in a very unconscious way, a very reckless way. I'm not saying the guilt people, because when you were saying about the guilt people, it felt to me like they were still had a layer of proving their worth in the
Oh,
world,
for sure,
and like, look, I'm sort of, I am good. But at least they were functioning out in the world and able to do things. Whereas the shame people, when you were talking about the shame prone, it felt like they were more lost out there. And I think there's also this lack of wiring where not only has the shame crippled them, but actually, how do I move out into the world in a more positive way? The shame reduces taking any risks, doesn't it, of any form, really? Because recklessness is risky behaviour. It's done from a very cut-off, couldn't care less.
Yeah, because there's no thought of the repercussions to self or other people.
No. It's interesting, isn't it, to maybe us to think more about the working with empathy, the not working with empathy.
What helps? How does change happen?
Yeah.
And also, what I was thinking about as you were talking is, what's the secondary gain of that behaviour?
Yeah.
In the sense of, I don't take risks.
If you're crippled with shame internally, there's a self-consciousness, isn't there, that you're not. You've got the anger as a defence often, and often actually with real deep shame, there's rage as a defence.
100%.
And so that keeps people away, that keeps you away from people, and so it must be really, really tough to come into the world without that defence. Really, really difficult. We're talking at the extreme end of shame, aren't we? Really. But I think the secondary gain is, I think in my experiences, it's often how hard it is to change, and that it's going to require you to move away, say for instance, from rage and anger into vulnerability. The very thing often that we need to get us into a much more healthy place just is terrifying. It's terrifying, isn't it? To move away from my rage and anger, which feels really powerful, into help, or I'm scared, or I'm frightened, or to get across the bridge from that place to the other place is just impossible. And so we spend a lot of time discussing the pros, the cons, the backwards and forwards, and not actually moving, taking those baby steps. Although they might be happening, I do see that often as a place with longer term clients where you just could remain stuck forever.
And I think that's an important point. Moving on to how does it show up in the therapy room, because you might not obviously connect shame to some presentations, like if somebody has anger issues or is rageful, you might spend a lot of time working on that, which is a symptom, and not realise that actually it comes from the shame in place. You initially feel shamed by something and it feels so awful inside, like we all know how visceral that feeling is, that your defence is to attack the other and go, how dare you make me feel this? And that's where the blaming position starts and the rageful position starts. It really is because you can't bear to tolerate those feelings of shame. But I think perhaps if you've got a really blaming person, then it might be that you get whipped up in the therapy room and forget, or don't even realise that actually what's underlying that is this shameful place.
Absolutely. So you could be on the receiving end of a lot of anger or a lot of blame, and you're not good enough and all of that stuff, until you have to be quite robust for yourself as a therapist to be able to tolerate, to stand in the fire with them sometimes and be able to just work into what's going on underneath here. At that very end of that continuum of rage and anger, the bottom line was shame.
You know where my mind went to then was to that old Hitchcock film Psycho and Norman Bates, and what you learn is that he'd been shamed by his mother, hadn't he? Terribly abused and shamed by his mother.
But that's at that extreme continuum. I do think we have to have done an ongoing work really with our own shame. And you said something there that I want to go back to, which is, I certainly find with my own experience of shame, is it's intolerable. When it comes up, it's so difficult, but nothing in you wants to stay with that.
You want to disappear, don't you?
Nothing in you wants to stay with that. So when you think about, and that's the other thing about working in the room with the other, you've got the other's eyes. If you think about shame, it's like it's impossible to tolerate on your own with yourself, and then when you're in a room with a therapist and you've got their eyes, it doesn't matter if, let's say they're on the empathy route, it doesn't matter how empathic they are, you've got that huge barrier to get past.
Because you feel exposed.
Exactly.
Don't you?
Exactly.
You feel, even when you're on your own, you feel exposed.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's interesting, I had a patient yesterday who wanted to disclose something, and she was literally squirming around in the seat. And the only way she could tell me was to cover her own face with her hands. And that's that childlike thing, isn't it? Of if I can't see you, then maybe you can't see me.
But you always have, with shame, the eyes can't meet you. You know, it's exactly that.
Yeah.
It's that powerful.
It can't be seen, don't expose me. And I think that's important to remember when you're a therapist, because we want to stay with and communicate that, and I'm with and I'm going to hold your gaze, and actually that's counterproductive when you're trying to get the shame from somebody. Yeah. And sometimes I will actually say, look, I won't look at you, I'll look at the floor, or I'll look out, or will it help you if you look out the window?
Yeah, or we might do an exercise where I'll say, let's both close our eyes.
Yeah.
Because I suppose thinking about my own experiences of just being exposed, but then having to tolerate the other in the room, and it doesn't matter how much within you are just with that person and not judging with any part of your being. We all just know we've got to get past the mind at that point, haven't we? I do think the other thing is that, how do we stay with shame? Because I do think it is intolerable.
It's toe curling for everybody, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you watch somebody, I don't know, on TV or wherever, or out in the street, you see something where someone else is being shamed. You can't. You can't turn away. It's just excruciating.
It does feel linked to me with just deep imperfection, and that's a funny word to use. Because if you think about the stock line of not being good enough that most patients come up with, we come up with ourselves as human beings. We're all walking around out there feeling that we don't measure up at all, and it's like we're so hard on ourselves with making mistakes or getting things wrong, or just thinking about tripping up a pavement, or who's watched us, who's seen us, and we're very red, and there's a lot of embarrassment. There's this thing about self-consciousness and embarrassment. When you said at the beginning, we're not born with it, I thought, no, for me it's that moment we come into
awareness of self.
So I don't know, 18 months, 2 years old, or whatever, when we do something, and how that's managed, how that shame is managed. We have to say to someone, oh no, don't do that, and then we can see the little child averts its eyes, and then we can feel that that's the first time that they've felt they've done something wrong. But we might have to say don't do that, because we're pulling them away from something electrical, or they've been told off by someone that they love. And then how that mother or that carer handles it, and then there's this idea of saying, come over here and come and sit on my lap,
and that's the reparative word.
That's the reparative. Give them a cuddle. But of course, if and you see this often with children, they then get into defensiveness. There's a little person of anger, and they have a little tantrum.
Yeah.
And then the mother or the carer or the father can't deal with it. They're out in public.
Yeah.
So they're now being seen by others, and they're telling themselves, oh my goodness, they're thinking I'm a terrible mother here, and they start to control
their own shame.
They start to control that child, don't they? And you watch it escalate, and then the repair doesn't happen.
No, exactly.
The mother and father's feeling ashamed because the child is acting out right from that early age, and then it begins, doesn't it? There's the memory bank, and then more and more gets put in there, really. And where I also go to then is those excruciating adolescent years, and I think there you've just got a huge bucket where you just keep adding, and you don't need other really through the adolescent. I think a lot of it is your own
stuff.
Your own. I remember walking along the road, and I had this outfit on that I really liked myself in, but when I went walking down the road in it, oh my goodness, I couldn't get home quick enough. My cheeks were burning. I was thinking that the cars were passing by, and I thought this was going to be experienced where I was thinking, look at me, don't I? But I was just projecting out. I feel awkward walking in these shoes, and I don't think I had these jeans, and all going on in my head. But that very powerful memory for me of feeling very self-conscious in the world. I can remember the road. I just wanted to get home and hide. Nobody was doing anything. The powerfulness of that going on in my head.
Perception. And I really relate to that, this idea of walking along the street and thinking that everybody in every car is looking at you.
Exactly.
And, you know, maybe some are, but maybe some are thinking about their day, or they're in their own thoughts, or dealing with their own shame.
Absolutely.
But it's the feeling that every single car is passing you, is looking at you.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing we see again and again when we're working with shame, is how that person, you know, the story in their head is that everybody is discussing them, talking about them, thinking about them, judging them, and like they've become the centre of the universe, and it's just maybe they judged you for 30 seconds, not even that, and then they went into their own stuff.
Yeah. But I think it neatly, or very ugly really, connects with not measuring up. Deep defects, we're just not, you know, pick really. And I suppose we've got so many memories of that, but I think that there's a lot of connection there about the embarrassment and shame really.
And the other thing that emerged was that guilt seeks to do the reparative work. So if you feel guilty about something, you need to get it off your chest, you need to confess it, you need to tell someone, you need to do something about it, and it's a motivating force, whereas shame just wants to hide it away and have nobody ever know.
So that's really important,
because they're not going to mention
you
it.
Then can't bring it out into the daylight, and you cannot have any input. You can't have your own input. You know, when you're thinking a bit clearer on it, you can't process it, and you can't have others' input because you're not going to readily share it. It just gets stuck inside and gets added to. It almost feels like, doesn't it?
And in the therapy room, you won't be necessarily actively talking about those things, so it's more what's not said rather than
well, I think you can't get to it. I think you can't get to it because it's what we said earlier. It's like you've got the eyes of the therapist, you've got your own self-consciousness, and there's no way you're going to readily, because you haven't had much practice, plop that shame out on the table and say, right, let's have a good old talk about that. You know, you do see people just, and ourselves included, struggle to just say, right, let's talk about shame. Let's talk about all the excruciatingly painful places. And yet, if you think about Brené Brown, you know, the whole thing is just, unless we talk, we know this, but unless we really have a different relationship with shame, we have no power.
But that's a really hard place. I was thinking about this a bit more generally today about therapy, because you can't get someone to that place. You know, the whole thing about therapy really is that person has to be willing to travel.
Absolutely.
And particularly, you know, shame is the root, isn't it? It's right there at the bottom of the well, the dirty, dark place. And it wants to be hidden. And only people that are willing to do that journey are going to do that journey.
And I suppose I'm thinking of Brené Brown again, because she's a champion of bring it to the light, bring it to the light. Really, we need to join forces with this idea that we do need to bring it to the light. And because that's the difficult thing, like she was saying, years ago she'd maybe go and people say, oh, what should talk about? And it'd be like shame, and people say, oh, I'm not really, you know, and they get up and leave.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, so it's like we want to be talking about it more, we want to be bringing it into the light more, but nobody wants to stay in the room.
Because nobody wants to sit with their own.
Nobody wants to sit with their own, you know, so when we think about that then as therapists, it's very, very important that you have relationships in your life where you really do feel that you have somebody, you know, like we do with each other, where we probably can feel that we can talk a little bit about that out loud, and how important that other is really.
But
and I think
look at the journey we've both been on to get there.
The journey we've been on to get there has been absolutely, literally long, and hasn't it?
Yeah.
But it's like that was the gift for us really. But I was also thinking about why is it easier sometimes maybe for me to be like that with you, but then might not so much with my partner. And I was thinking about that actually the difficulty that we have with, and I see this with patients as well, is that our partners have also been, I mean, you and I haven't been in that position, and touch wood we won't be, we have a different relationship, but our partners have also we've gone through hurting with our partners where shame has been created.
And hurting each other.
So our partners have been friends and our partners have been enemies. But if they've been friends and enemies, then they're not always, well, if you're friends, they might be the go-to person to share your shame with. But you also know that they've been the shamer as well sometimes. Or if they've not been the shamer, we've felt like they have been. It's been in our head that they've been the shamer because they've shut us down or they've been cold with us, or and I think there is nothing that takes me to my shame more than somebody cutting me out, because I think there is this thing about existence with shame.
Yeah, I don't exist. Absolutely.
So then with sulking in its lesser form, but in the cold, cutting off, treating you like you don't exist as your loved one, you go into this very deep non-existence. That's the heart, really, I often think. And maybe then that takes me back to prisons, it takes me back to the reckless behaviour. When we think about those men, it's like they've got nothing to lose because they don't exist. There's no existing here. I've got nothing to lose because the core of shame, we're nothing, we're nobody. We don't exist.
And I think that point emerges when we're shaming another. To go back to something you were talking about before, about young people, and you were talking about adolescents and young people, and we often talk about the way the world is now, because there is public shaming. There it is on YouTube. You used to be shamed in your community or in your class or within your family, and now you're shamed in a planetary way.
Absolutely.
It's out there forevermore.
Yeah.
This isn't going to fade with time in people's memories.
Yeah.
It's there forevermore out there in the ether. So we live in that age of public shaming, and how when we do that, when we shame another, we're really treating them as though they don't exist, because we're thinking of them as an object.
Exactly.
We're not thinking of them as a person, where there was a context to what they did or didn't do.
We're not even interested in the context.
No.
We're interested in the snapshot
and the
snapshot.
feeding off that.
Yeah. And then if you think about that, we are doing such great damage to the world when we do that, because we are feeding the shame, and we're feeding the dark and not the light. So one is you've got the social media, social shaming, tearing someone down, and it's a bit like throwing apples at the bad person,
in the stocks,
on the stocks, and it's like everybody feeding off of that very old way of publicly putting someone right out in the middle and throwing things at them, and they go underground in the end. What we're then doing is we're setting the bar really, really low, because we might be in the audience at that point, but then what when we're in the stocks? What when suddenly we are on the receiving end of that? And the other thing that we do, I feel, as a society is, again, this goes back to us being where there's not any leeway to make mistakes. Heads roll, people are torn down, we want blood. Someone's made a mistake in their job, it goes public, and everybody says, get rid of her, sack him. And then everybody's waiting, off with his head, bang, he's gonna go, or she's gonna go. And we might all be pleased in a way or there might be a part of us saying, good, that's good, and so they should. But what we're cultivating more and more is shame.
But see, I wonder if our desire to off with their head is going back to what we said a little while ago, which is we can't bear to sit with the shame.
No.
So we're going to rub it out from over there.
We're going to get rid of it.
We're going to get rid of
that, and now we haven't got to worry about it anymore. He doesn't work there, she doesn't work there anymore. Till the next time.
Absolutely.
So there's no working through, there's no human to human. All right, there might be certain situations where people have to go. And what we're not showing this younger generation is like they can't make a mistake. They can't get it wrong. So for me, how it manifests in the room when I work with young people is they are terrified of making a mistake in their work. Their anxiety levels are through the roof because they are seeing a culture where you've got to get it right all the time. So, I do see where it contributes as well to them going out in the world. They're terrified, it's a real fear culture. The shaming really cultivates the fear, doesn't it, out there?
It does, and you said a word before, this stifling Because the only way we learn is by making mistakes, isn't
Exactly.
it? How do you grow?
Exactly that.
How do you grow if you know, oh, that's the wrong road to go down? Or
But you see, then the much bigger picture is litigation and the blaming and the shaming, whereas it's in the mistakes where we learn the most. But we're terrified now because we think that there's going to be the consequences, which is she's going to be sacked, she's going to be sacked. But if we don't also say there's a place for making mistakes and learning from mistakes, because all the training in the world cannot give you what making a mistake. Of course, ideally, we don't want to make mistakes.
it's not
But it's
realistic,
where
is
we
it?
learnt it, and then it's the reparative, it's the rupture repair, even in therapy. So we get it wrong, and then we say to our client, "I'm sorry about that." They come back and they feel brave enough to come back, and they say to us, "When you said that last time, I felt really whatever." If they're brave enough to do it, and we can be defensive in that moment, or we can say, "Tell me more."
I had that last week. Somebody said, "You really hurt me. Not you made me angry, you hurt me.
Yeah.
It was even worse for me."
Yes.
So it was okay, and she was justified in
Yeah.
what she said. And my first response was, I'm really heartfelt, so terribly sorry that something I said caused you
Absolutely.
pain.
Yeah.
And she said to me, that is the first time anybody has just sat there and said, "I'm sorry."
Absolutely.
Now, whether it really is the first time,
Yeah.
but for her in that moment, it felt like it was.
But in a way, there was that welcoming space.
And how brave for her to come and tell me.
Absolutely. Well, but that's it, isn't it? Either they might vote with their feet, but if you're lucky enough that they can come back, there is the rupture, there's the repair. As therapists, are we going to be defensive? Are we going to need to puff ourselves up? Because that's the wonderful moment where are we going to be able to tolerate their anger in the room, and are we going to be able to drop it down and say, "Tell me more about that"? And there we go back to intention. We're not justifying it on our side, and we can say, "I'm really sorry if that was your experience, and that genuinely wasn't my intention."
But years ago, it would take me to a very different place because I wouldn't have been able to tolerate my own shame.
Exactly.
Not that she wanted to shame me, but I'd have shamed myself.
Yeah.
And I was listening to a TED talk by Monica Lewinsky, the girl that had the affair with Clinton. And she was talking about the world of the internet and how things are
Public
out there
shaming.
forever, public shaming. And she was saying about young people that commit suicide. And indeed, the suicide rates are higher for a shame-prone person, as you might imagine. But she was saying that you can tolerate it. You don't think that you can, but you do learn that you can tolerate your shame. And so that's why I think going back to how do we work with it and how might our own relationship with shame impact our work is because if you can't sit there with yourself and your own shame, you're not going to be able to do that with your patient, are you? You're just not.
And it might be, as you say, tougher when someone says, "I'm hurt," but I would find that easier to meet than I would somebody coming back in absolutely furious. Where do we work with rage? How do we work with anger? And again, not that we have to tolerate rage as therapists, but I think that's some of the hardest to work with, not necessarily hot anger, but cold anger in the room, where somebody is just furiously
kind of
angry,
passive aggressive,
but they are absolutely
not going to
just not going to move at all. And you might be, as a therapist, work in every way you can to sort of see if there's a way to connect, and then you say, well, okay, we'll just both sit in it together. But I think that's one of the hardest things, because what gets triggered in you, if somebody is not going there, then you as a therapist, your shame might be triggered about my skills here, I can't connect here, I'm usually quite good, but I can't connect here, and they are not doing anything, but your mind is saying, perhaps I'm not the right person, I think I'll refer them on, and that's always a sign, isn't it, that you're finding it too difficult. But often it's because you want to quickly offload it, you want to get it out, you want to get it away from you, because it's not running as well as you want it to run, it's not as smooth, you can't find that connection.
I think I go to that place a lot, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, and I remember once with a client, they weren't just angry, they were very attacking, and then they started attacking the room and attacking a picture that I had in the room. But I remember thinking, oh, I chose that picture, and that picture means a lot to me, and when they left, I was
What a good deflection, though.
I was so angry, but I was really hurt. But it's funny, in my defences it was like, right, that's it, I don't want to work with you again and all of this, and it was like, what on earth's going on here? You have to get into your own stuff, don't you? But you have to be willing to do that. You really do, because when that person comes back, you've got to then be able to say, can we talk about what happened?
Yeah. When I'm thinking about their part in that, so you had your part in your journey and you needed to get into a different space with it, and great that you wanted to come back from that. And I'm also thinking about their part in it, and again, it's these subtle things that point towards shame that we can miss because we're trying to deal with the surface thing. You know, if someone's in a rage at you, you're trying to deal with that surface thing. But, you know, the minute somebody's going on and on and on about someone else, or on and about that out there, or this over here, or distracting over, it's like, what are you not addressing when you're going on and on and on about that?
It's like we can take all of that bigger world and he and she and this and that, and then when you bring it back to you, what's the bottom line? Because it's about your relationship with that, isn't it? And how you're struggling, really. It's your struggle. That I think the defence of rage and the defence of anger, I don't know how much we're trained in that. I think it would be valuable training, actually, for therapists.
Yeah, because if you think about it, I think all the times I've gone for training that's anything to do with managing anger, shame's never mentioned. I'm sure I'm right in saying that. I don't remember anybody that's talked about shame in connection with anger. It's been a lot of cognitive or behavioural good stuff.
Yes, but like, you know, the link there, really. Because it's like, how does it turn up in the room? How do we work with it? I think one of the most difficult things is that it's impossible to work with something that we all want to move away from.
Avoid.
You know, lots of people don't necessarily want to cross to that side, but actually that's what we need to be thinking about, really, and just saying, let's talk about it.
Knowing you can survive it. And I must have told you this story before. I went to do a meeting that I thought was about meditation. And there was this guy who was very much in kind of guru phase, you know, and a small group of people. And you know me, I'm a questioner. I want to know about everything. And particularly more so when I was young. So I was asking him a lot of questions, coming from a place of like, oh, teach me, you know, I was really excited. And he obviously found me troublesome. And his way of wanting to deal with that was to get people to laugh at me and ridicule me. And it was the first time in my life, instead of retreating and feeling shame and closing up like a fan and wanting to disappear, in that moment it was magical. I kind of saw him for who he was, and I just knew inside myself I could survive this. And it's honestly the first time I think I learned that I could stand being shamed.
I'm thinking of that Monica Lewinsky again, and just thinking that if you have survived, that was you in that room with that. What was interesting with you is you were able to see the process of it while you were in the content, because shame is so crippling. Often the content just wipes us out, doesn't it? But you, for whatever reason, that whatever space you were in, you could see the bigger picture, the process, know the content, and not drown in it. Actually, your thinking still stayed online, didn't it? You stayed, as they say, in the window of tolerance, and your thinking must have been able to stay online because you were seeing it so much clearer. But surviving it, I suppose, starts to then say, okay, I can.
It's tolerable.
Okay, it's tolerable. I wonder how different you feel once the worst has happened. Because in a way, it's the worst, isn't it? Public ridicule, and you've done something, like for her, done something where there's a lot of shame associated often with sex, isn't there? And so all these subjects we don't talk about necessarily, and that's public, and then the worst has happened. In a horrific way, you've survived something. Nothing else can touch it. It's like when we talk about getting out your comfort zones, don't we? Is there freedom in the end? When it gets to that when you've had something as horrific as that happen, and you've tolerated it, do you then stand the other side and say, well, nothing can touch me now? And is your shame expanded so much that you actually end up the winner? You don't think you are, but those comfort zones have been just expanded to such a level that you go in and, you know, tripping up and this, that and the other, and all the tiny things really are nothing anymore.
Because there's no fear. And she was saying that one of the things that she felt saved her, because she said it nearly drove her to death, to the point where her mum made her shower with the door open, just to make sure that she was safe. But she said for her it was the empathy of her family, like everyone really supported her.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So the empathy with something like that, I suppose, it's people being on your side, isn't it, as well?
And saying you are okay, you're not some ugly alien. She was 22 when this happened. She said, who can put their hand up in this room and say they never made a mistake or misjudged anything at the age of 22? Of course you do.
Yeah. So that brings me back to our relationship with making mistakes. I fear at the moment with how the world is and social media is just like very unforgiving. So again, forgiveness comes in, doesn't it, really? Which we're not necessarily very good at, but it's okay to make mistakes. But I think often our hardest judge to convince is our own, isn't it?
We're worse bully to ourselves than anyone
ourselves.
else. Yeah, exactly.
That's the hardest.
What do you think we've taken away from what we've discussed today?
I think how genuinely difficult it is, even if you consciously want to work with shame, how genuinely difficult it is. I actually think if you're really going to get to the core of this, it's got to be an ongoing subject that you're curious about, carrying on through your career as a therapist or just as a human being. And I think that we as therapists have to have an ongoing relationship with shame, which we're never going to go, yippee, that's good. But I think we have to make a commitment, I think, to engage with shame, because that's where all the richness is, that's where we'll learn more. But I think if we can tolerate that, if we can have a relationship with it, I think that there's not much that we can't face in the room with our clients. And it's like if we really, really get into relationship with it, there's not much we can't face in our work, really.
I think that's what I'll take away from today, actually, is thinking about our audience as therapists and how they're going to work with it, is the ways, the many faces it wears, many masks it wears.
Absolutely, yeah.
And just remembering that when you're dealing with all of those things.
Yeah. And if we make a commitment, do some ongoing work, then we are really, really helping our patients, because we can walk alongside them. You know, we're not going to be an obstacle. And if we are, because we're human and we make mistakes, because it's not, again, when I say it, about us being perfect, and we're going to get it wrong, but giving ourselves permission to do all of that. So also know the many faces of how it turns up in us.
Yes.
Not just in our clients, but how it turns up in us. I mean, we really know we cracked it if we go, well, that's that again. And we can learn every time to just tolerate it a little bit more and name it a little bit more and not want to shut it down or run away from it. I think it's really big.
I think it's very, very interesting and universal.
And I think it's been allowed to get bigger because it goes inward. So it's ended up having a lot more power, and the more we can externalise it and the more we can tolerate it, then the less power it's going to have, really.
There's so many, many positive things about the internet and our modern life and technology, but I think the negative side is, I think it's just social collapse. You know, these things just lead to absolute social breakdown, don't they?
Yeah.
The blaming and the
absolutely.
lack of empathy and the no boundaries. And
if people aren't and don't have close relationships where they can really talk about the difficult things and feel safe to do that.
And the freedom I feel when I sit with you, like I can just really, really be me.
Absolutely.
In all my parts.
Yeah.
And I don't have to worry about that or explain.
And that's really what also helped Monica Lewinsky get through, didn't she? Was that the importance of others in our life. And I guess that's another thing to think about when we're working as therapists. What are the support structures out there for others? Do they have one significant person that they feel they can show some of that to, that they feel safe enough to show some of that to? Because there's something about that really dispels or dilutes shame.
Because it can be so lonely. And if I go to you, oh my God, and you go, oh yeah, you know, it's no longer lonely.
It's no longer lonely, and it's no longer as big and as ugly and as horrible as it is. I think the two things have come up for me as you said that. One is how you work with it in the room when you've got somebody that is full of shame, and you have to really work at how you position yourself as a therapist, because I often find when I'm working somewhere where there's a lot of shame, it might be somewhere where I disclose a little bit more about me, because it's kind of like that human thing. If the shame has put me into a position of them and us, you know, she's the authority, or shame has done that, I find it interesting when I find myself saying, well, this is my experience.
Didn't Kathy Steele talk about that when we went to see her?
I think she did, actually.
About literally sharing your shame, you know, not to traumatise them or disclose any important details, but just so that they can remember that it's a universal thing. You could stop every car out there and say, do you know what shame feels like? And everyone put their hand up.
Yeah.
Because we all do.
So I think, but I also think it's a fine line, because you've also got to be aware that this person could get defensive or attacked, and they could then use that vulnerability that you've shared.
Absolutely.
So you've also got to be quite robust enough to be able to see that process, to know that that could happen. Again,
because that's what happens in relationships.
Exactly.
You mentioned that with the partner.
Partners, yeah.
You know, when you're doing the heartfelt thing, you'll say to them, oh, well, I felt this and I felt that. And then when you're in the middle of a row, they may use that against you.
So you've got to know that. So it's a fine line. It's not about sharing a lot, but I think it's having a purpose to share a bit of the humanness.
Illustrate.
This is about, when you work in group, there's absolute relief that him over there and her over there is telling my story. And when you're in one-to-one, that doesn't happen. And I think that we have to bring that in at times, if it feels safe enough, because there's that humanness, that normalising that shame happens, really. I think therapists like to have something concrete, don't they? Because shame is so difficult to enter, also doing some psychoeducational stuff with clients is very important, because it's, when we're looking at it psychoeducationally, we're not living it and breathing
we're in our heads,
and we can talk about shame, but I think there's a place for that, because that might be what's tolerable at that point.
Absolutely.
I can talk about it, go away and on my own and have a reflect on that.
So I think maybe that's a point.
Always.
Shame will be in the...
I can't be responsible for that. Often when you think there's a session that, you know, you really don't feel that anything from your judgment or your point of view, and they may come back and say, that was the most helpful session, and you're like, oh my goodness. And that's such a humbling experience, because it's a great reminder. Just your willingness to be with this person and let them find their own
wisdom.
way.
Yeah, exactly.
So there it is, wise ones. Today's Ask It podcast with Leslie and Lucinda, senior psychotherapists, asking, how do we tolerate shame and how do we work with it in the therapy room? Thanks for listening.